Welcome to our final segment on training and development. Now, it truly is so that your people make the difference between one organization and the other, and your capabilities and your achievements. So, training and developing people makes them stronger. Training and developing people makes your organization stronger. So, what's the difference between training and education? Well, education tends to be formalized. It's the thing that you do in school for the most part. Training tends to be a lot more hands-on. It's often done in the job, and it's often a reflection of receiving some instruction, doing something, and receiving feedback on the thing that you're doing. So it's really a way to build on the educational foundation and to develop some specific skills. And in fact, that training aspect is one of the key ways that you develop specific skills and knowledge on how to do certain things in the workplace. So usually most of the educational exposure you have leading up to the workplace is in that educational space, although you may supplement it while you're on the job as well. But training is really kind of focuses on a specific skill set developments. Now, in organizations, training is a good thing, but you don't train just because it feels like it's a good thing or because you think it might be a good thing. It really needs to align with the needs of the organization. So, training is a great way to solve things where lack of skill is an issue or inconsistency in skill is an issue. If the issue that you're seeing isn't related to a skill gap, then training doesn't necessarily fix that, right? So any of the quality problems and challenges the organization has, part of the answer in this case would need to be training in order for it to be worth pursuing that. So one of the things that we'll see consistently in this space, particularly in the training and development space in organizations, is that there isn't necessarily the care spent to look at the alignment with the organizational needs. And it gets done because it feels like it's the right thing to do. It's what I would refer to as a faith-based investment. And one of the problems with those is that they don't always necessarily fit the reality that you're in. And because they're not tied specifically to specific business outcomes, if you go through some financial difficulties or anything, it's one of the first things that they stop doing, because there isn't a direct connection between what this does and the change it makes in an organization. Although truly, the correct kinds of developments that speak to organizational needs and objectives can transform what your organization is capable of doing. But they need to kind of fit with that. They need to fit with the alignment of the organization overall. That training also needs to receive management support and commitment. So not only in rolling it out, but in supporting the behavior. Because at the end of the day, training is about teaching someone to do something differently than what they're doing today. So what you need to be able to do is you need to be able to support that behavioral change. And you do that by recognition for that, the outcome after, the training, supporting that that behavioral change on the job through reward and recognition programs and a variety of other things like that to really support that activity. Now, as I mentioned before, like training's great, but it can't solve things where the skill isn't the problem, right? If I find I'm having, an issue where we're having too many defects in something and we do some exploration and we discover that the issue comes down to it's a materials problem, right? Training doesn't fix that because the issue isn't training. If we come down to it, and yes, there's some materials problems, but we also find there's some inconsistencies between one shift and another and what they're doing, that's a training thing now. So part of it is training, part of it is materials management then, right? So, and it is common to find training needs in an organization, sometimes to fix deficiencies, but very often it's done to augment capacities, right? So one of the things that you frequently find is that the world changes around you. And as new business opportunities come up, you often have to augment skill sets in order to pivot to them. I've used this company as an example before. There's a local company here called Inksmith that used 3D printing technology to create a variety of educational materials. So these are kind of hands-on, puzzles and games and things like that that were used in an educational setting. I think primarily it was like primary grade stuff that they were making. With the pandemic, they've pivoted to using their design and 3D printing expertise, and they produce face shields. In fact, you can look them up. The face shield part of the organization is called the Canadian Shield. That's actually what they call the product itself. And they've found, in a new facility to be able to do it in. They've hired all kinds of people. Well, that pivoting, right? There's some commonality between what they were doing before and what they're doing now, right? So design approach, leveraging 3D printing technology. So there's some commonality for where the pivot happens. But making the educational toys and in the volumes that they made them, or making PPE in the volumes that they're going to make them, are different things. So there would be training requirements in pivoting existing staff if you're moving them from one area to the other. There's training needs for bringing in staff to learn how to do what it is that they're doing, right? And there'll be other training needs on top of it that will have to do with, packaging and materials management and customer fulfillment and a variety of other things that will be new because it's a new aspect of their business from the other one. So there's clearly a case where there are a number of different training needs on top of all kinds of other things they had going on in order to be able to pivot to take advantage of this new opportunity. That whole moving and changing and augmenting is a very, very common requirement. In fact, it's one of the things that if you can identify it organizationally, you're responding to it, lets you take advantage of an opportunity, often in a much more timelier fashion than your competition can. So as a process, you need to determine your needs, the organizational needs. You design the program, you deliver it, you evaluate the effectiveness, and then you take the lessons learned from that cycle and energize it back into the next time that you go through this cycle, right? You'd look at what worked, what didn't work so well, and some other changes so that the next time you iterate the cycle that it works a little better. I'll let you look at that on its own. Often there are things that trigger a needs assessment and analysis, right? So regulatory change, right? So there's been a law change and you have to report something differently, or they've made changes in forms. Okay, so something's got to be different. We have to figure out who is affected by that difference. What kind of training do we deliver to which audiences in order to, again, reinforce this behavioral change that we need to put in place? And then how do we make sure that we actually get compliance with that change after the fact? You install new systems, right, or new equipment. You have to train people on not only the use of it as well, because certainly in the equipment state, there's people using it, but then there's also people maintaining it, and they may be two different groups. So they'd require different training. You see the same thing with computerized systems, right, where there's user training, there's call center or like support staff training, there's maintenance staff kind of training, and it really depends on the role that somebody's going to play, the training that you deliver them, because the information that they need to do their job is different depending on which role that you have to play. So it's very common to have multiple different training streams from a particular activity. If you recognize that there's a skill that needs to be added or modified, you'll often do it for modification. You may not do it as often for adding. Often if the skill that you need is something that you add, even if it's short term, you may augment your workforce. So I may hire someone on contract for it, or hire somebody full-time for it. It depends on how deep the skill is. In many cases, it may not be worth developing it homegrown. It may make more sense to actually acquire someone with the requisite skills from outside. You do have to refresh previous training, particularly things that have to do with consistency and compliance. you usually have to revisit that stuff. If there's a need to qualify or certify for any particular kind of a program, like you have to go through recertification for your ISO. If you're a Microsoft certified engineer, you have to revisit that on a periodic basis. And then ultimately, if there's a skill deficiency, so you found an issue, you've drilled down and you found that there's someone or there's a group of people who aren't really up to snuff with a particular skill, and then that's the group that you're going to try to resolve that skill deficiency with. Now, your assessment can be individually. So often when you're doing quarterly or annually reviews, one of the things that you're looking at is, where do employees want to go? What kind of things do they want to do? And a lot of that often has to do with areas where they want to augment the skills that they have already. So that's one place that you can look at potentially identifying where training needs are. In a lot of cases, you'll find that what organizations will do is train people on the job, because often there are specifics enough on the job that you're very unlikely to hire somebody who would know all of those things. So you hire someone with the right base, and then you do the specific on the job training, which is really, really common. Everything from fairly entry, you get a job at McDonald's, right? And it's maybe the first job you've ever had. They're basically looking for people that can present themselves well, that have some base schooling. You probably didn't even have to finish high school, present themselves well. They're able to communicate okay. They're clean. They're, some fairly basic things. And then they'll train them on the job. And then they'll kind of move people. You tend to have an entry area where you bring everybody into that particular role. And then from there, you start to move people depending on the skills that they seem to be developing. I know when I had my cell phone business, the likelihood of hiring someone who actually knew how to fix phones was virtually nil. However, what we did do is we found people that had gone to school for electronics. In fact, all the people that I hired to be techs had all gone to Conestoga for electronics. So they understood resistance and circuits, and they had soldering skills and all of those base pieces. And then we trained them on the job specifically how to fix phones. And that's a pretty common approach that you find. Now, in your needs assessment, you'll be looking at existing information you have. Very often, particularly where you have in areas where you have multiple people doing similar things, you'll talk to kind of the best performers to get a sense of where things are. And you're often looking at kind of what makes the best performers versus everybody else. And, is there a methodology that I can learn from them that we can incorporate, that we can teach to everybody else to kind of raise the level field for everybody? You can use a very similar like voice of the customer kind of techniques, like focus groups, questionnaires, surveys, observation interviews. A lot of these other techniques are common because you're basically trying to discover or uncover, what's happening. If there's issues, what those issues look like. If there's inconsistency in performance, where does the inconsistency come from? And then you use that information to help build your training approach. Now, you can deliver content in a variety of different ways. Ideally, you usually use more than one format because different people respond to different materials. There are auditory learners, there are kinesthetic learners, there's a variety of different tools that work. So you tend to use more than one method during the course of any kind of particular training. There's some stuff here on adult learning. And then we look at some levels of cognition, or what you would call learning objectives. If you read, and you may or may not have, if you read the outcomes for any of the courses here at Conestoga, and you actually read the document, it will talk about, at the end of this course, you'll be able to do this, so on and so forth. The language that it uses indicates the level of cognition, or basically the level that a particular area or skill is taught to. Is it something where you'll be able to identify, recall, recognize? That's a knowledge level. Will you be able to understand what it means? That's a comprehension level. Will you be able to apply it? That's an application level, right? Can I break down information? Can I analyze it? Can I create, right, in a synthesis? And they're deeper levels, but in all, it isn't always deeper is better, right? It really depends on what the objectives of the overall course is. And actually, one of the experiences you should find in PQE here is that you should see the same material show up in more than one course. But what will happen is it will be taught to a deeper level in one course than the others. And the others, it will tend to reinforce the learnings of whatever the primary. So there'll be a concept that primarily will be taught. So for example, the Six Sigma course obviously is going to primarily teach about Six Sigma. Well, we've talked a little bit about Six Sigma in this course as well. And you probably will have it show up in another one as well. We're reinforcing the learning of the main one. And that's a common approach. Now, all training and all teaching, you have a lesson plan that you develop. And it's important because it's the roadmap to know where am I going and when am I going and what are things looking like at and how do we evaluate and what are evaluations meant to do. Some evaluations are meant to figure out where students are. Other evaluations are meant to identify how well they've learned the material or how well they have the ability to actually apply the material. So there's different tools that you use at different points. It is common that you usually have to develop more material than you actually use. You will change the material over time because you'll find some stuff seems to resonate better than others. As your audience changes, you'll have to change your materials. You have to practice the way that you deliver that material to find a way that it suits you and it's authentic to you, but is done in such a way that it keeps learners engaged and seems to reach students. You want to stimulate questions, and you want to be able to find ways to continue to engage with those students. Now, your methods of delivering, you can do self-directed stuff, which is where you can buy a workbook on your own and follow through it, or it could be on a CD, or it could be an online course that you take where it's kind of a self-directed. There's lectures and presentations like we've used in this course. There's discussions, which we've done as well. There's experiential, which you see a lot in courses that have labs and things like that, are using an experiential portion of it. A lot of hands-on development skills kind of need that experiential part of it. Coaching is important, which is really kind of one of the areas that kind of blurs the line between education and training, because in coaching, somebody's doing something and then they're getting feedback on the thing that they're doing, right? You look at case studies, so a specific circumstance of something that's happened, and what were the outcomes from it, and what are the lessons to be learned, and things like that. Workbooks, games and simulations, on-the-job training, right, or various different job aids. Sometimes, particularly if you're like rolling out a new computer system, and the way you input an order is different, they might create like a single page job aid that basically kind of gives you some shortcuts on what it means, the steps that you go through to place an order today, right? What that looks like in the new system, so that somebody can refer back to it as they're working through the changes, right? And they're trying to internalize the changes that they've just learned. This job aid helps them continue on that path. Now, ultimately, training is about behavioral change, and the behavioral change is about changing the effectiveness of the organization. So training is about changing your capacity. In order to know whether that works or not, you got to have a way to measure success. Now, it's very common at the end of a course that you evaluate, how well people have learned things, and you'll often ask things of the learner about whether they liked the experience and what things they might change. And that's one level of evaluation. But ultimately, you're training in an organization to try to get a different result. You need to really be measuring that different result. And as much as possible, you want to pick something that you can measure that is truly indicative of the role of the training. What I mean by that is, if we identify that there's some inconsistencies in our sales force, so we think we need to teach them on how to, build a strong funnel. So that's great. But if my measure of effectiveness is I'm looking for an increase in sales, there's a lot of stuff that has an effect on what your sales looks like. Building a good funnel is only one piece of it. So you're kind of measuring something that's not necessarily indicative of the value of what you do. What you really want to do in that case is you want to measure the actual funnels, right? So what did they look like before the training? What do they look like after the training? That's really what you want to measure, because what you're trying to do is make that change. Now, the belief is making the change with that will make them more effective at selling, which will increase your sales. But there's a few leaps that you got to make to get there. If you pick the wrong measurement tool and you measure something that doesn't really measure the actual thing that you did, you're not getting a very effective response from that particular training. And crucially, you need to support the behavioral change that you're trying to drive organizationally.